things you gotta consider with the tribal priority window. Things you need to check. One, is there land to claim? Eligible lands. We actually printed out maps of all 640 tribal lands that have considered tribal lands for this procedure. And there's 504 that have available spectrum. And we have maps online if you want to use it. I do what Crystal tells me to do. So she's like, people need to see something a little bit more specific. We have a searchable database. And we're going to keep updating this with whatever it is that Crystal tells us tribal nations need in order to understand what they need for the spectrum. So let's see, if I was going to look at, let's see.
Who wants to see spectrum over there, a license over their lands?
I want to Isleta first, period. We can do more, and it's online, so you folks can log in right now and look.
What's the website? Muralnet.org?
Muralnet.org/EBS opportunity. Let me go back. You know what, I should make this just our front landing page at this point. This is the important part. You don't need to see like other random pictures or mission statements or stuff. This is what it's about. So Muralnet's EBS opportunity, you can do it by state. Like Mr. Garcia was pointing out, the states actually have been pretty great allies. California Public Utility Commission, for example, really wants to help a lot when it comes to that middle mile and making things accessible. But then the way the maps work is, right now we're keeping it very simple. We can go to whatever level of complexity you need. So for Isleta, you can see the green area, this is where there's spectrum available. The red area, there's no spectrum available. So when it comes to what they can claim, this is it. And if I look up top, it looks like they can claim all the spectrum in this land. All of this is unlicensed. So up top it says maximum spectrum available, minimum spectrum available. I found one little bug. If for some reason your tribal lands are recognized as having zero population, then it says there's zero, that'll be zeroed out. I'll fix that bug. That's mostly the Hawaiian homelands and the agricultural lands that they have. But one, you need to know what lands that you're claiming and what channels. There's 3 channels again, channel 1, channel 2, and channel 3. So you'll probably have to upload a shapefile. We will help anyone who needs help making shapefiles. But basically what that means is, like, let's say I want to take this part and I want all 3 channels, and then my neighbor wants to claim the other part of that. We have to make sure our shapefiles don't overlap. And so there needs to be some coordination there if you're trying to split up the spectrum geographically. Now, I want to point out something interesting. Let's look at Navajo. They always have interesting situations. Do you see how Navajo has yellow lands here? So the green is definitely they have spectrum available. The yellow are off-trust lands, which there's some special weird backdoor way that they could possibly be accepted as tribal lands. I'm going to defer to Edia because you've been studying this much more. What's the situation there with the off-trust lands?
So to be able to qualify for this opportunity, the FCC decided that off-reservation lands don't count. But if you, for some reason, the FCC had already recognized your off-reservation land as tribal land, then it could qualify for this. So you have off-reservation land. Let's talk after, because there might be a possibility where the FCC already recognizes it. But if it doesn't, it's going to be challenging.
You're going to want to email the FCC. It's at rural tribal window at fcc.gov. I'm sorry, Irene.
The only context in which off-reservation lands would have been designated by the FCC as tribal is in the context of Lifeline. Lifeline is the program for low-income households. So when the FCC reformed the Lifeline program a number of years ago, they gave tribes an opportunity, if they wanted to come to the commission and petition and say, well, these lands, there are certain rules associated with it, had to be closely associated with the tribe, and they could be then designated for purposes of the Lifeline program, because for Lifeline, there's a subsidy available for all low-income households nationwide, but a higher subsidy available for low-income households on tribal lands. To my knowledge, no one has Yes, petition. At least by the time I left the commission, nobody had. There may be a few
We've
that
heard
have
that
since.
there's a couple of tribes that have, but you have, I would say investigate. Yeah, but you're right, it's a very, the FCC really kept it narrow. They were like, how are we gonna squeeze this out? And they chose to not do off-reservation.
What was written in the rules is you had to go through this whole process by this certain date, by June of 2019, to qualify your off-trust lands,
Off-reservation.
off-reservation lands. 0 entities had gone through it by that time. However, by pushing on the FCC, they're like, okay, well, there's some that have gone through Lifeline. They mentioned 2, right? And all of a sudden now those 2 are acceptable. My point is by pushing on the FCC, things change. So that's why we put them in there and get them as yellow. Because email them, push with them, talk with them. Maybe this rule isn't set in stone yet. Yes?
So there's a tribal community along the Columbia River. It's part of the Yakima Nation, but it's a recognized Indian community. Are they eligible? It's a very traditional community.
Is it state recognized?
No,
Or?
it's federally, it's part of the Yakima Nation, but they're not in the Columbia River, which is their ancestral home.
Does the tribal lands have a specific name?
Pardon me?
Do you know the federally recognized name?
Well, they're part of the Yakima Nation, but these particular lands are not where the reservation is in Washington State. It's in Oregon, along the Columbia
Is
River.
this Salilo Village?
Yes, Lilo Village, exactly.
We
yeah.
just connected them for the next 3 years because it was too confusing.
Now, what's interesting about that, you still want the spectrum because this is a resource, and this is a once in a lifetime situation. This EBS spectrum that they're allowing you to get access to is actually great spectrum. So even if you're already connected, grab the spectrum if you can. I just pulled it up. This is what I have for Yakima. If it has a separate name, I will look under the separate name. It's also here in the front if you want to see.
It's called Lilo Village. You said they're hooked up with what
Yep.
you said? Yeah.
Yeah, every home has internet access.
Can you give me the first 3 letters?
CEILO, Salilo?
Oh, yeah.
CELI, how do you spell it?
Hello.
I made it so you only have to be part of the word because spelling's not my forte. Yeah, I'm not saying
It
anything.
won't show up because it's Yakima.
Yeah.
So is the term limited to 3 years?
No, this is a separate,
This is-
this is a separate thing that Google did.
How does the license work? Is there?
I'm going to defer to you that.
It's
If you become an ISP, is it subject to tribal law and choice of law and, whatever dispute resolution that's provided for in tribal law, if you're the provider?
So once the license is issued to a licensee, the licensee has to meet a build-out requirement. And that is what MuralNet can help with, is setting up, building some facilities using that spectrum so you're not warehousing it or hoarding it, you're actually using it. Once you've met your build-out restriction, once you've met your build-out requirement, that license is then yours from the date that you got it for a 10-year period. There also then is a renewal expectation. So you can continue to renew that license for periods of 10 years in perpetuity.
So can I make a suggestion? So we have 30 minutes left in an hour and a half panel, and there's, I know you have a presentation, other folks have some things to say. So the Tech and Telecom Subcommittee is in this room immediately after, and Matt and I are more than, this is such an important opportunity, we're more than willing to stretch and continue this into our time for the subcommittee. We got all of our presentations done yesterday. We only have a few resolutions to take up, including some input on these rules. So I know some of the things that have been asked are going to be answered, what you have to say, and then there are other detailed questions that may require some follow-up. But I don't know if there was more you wanted to add so that
I'm going to
others could.
introduce the other big question, which is who can claim the spectrum, but then also punt it over to Sean so we can both chime in on that one. We've been talking a lot with the FCC about what it is. They say any consortium, the tribal nation, and any tribally controlled and owned, majority-owned entity. But they don't quite, it's all very fuzzy right now, and they don't really know what that means. Do you want to transition at this point, Sean, so you can start there, or do you?
I have a slide on that, that's perfect. Yeah. All right. So last week, as it turns out, I did a webinar on 10 questions that tribes would want to know when trying to navigate this tribal priority filing window. I'm not going to go through all of these 10 questions here, but the webinar is available on my website, my firm's website, and I can provide that link to those of you who are interested after this. But what I will start on is who are the tribal entities that are eligible to apply. So that's question number 5 there. So just give me a second as I get up to that. So there are 2 requirements to be an applicant in the tribal filing window. The first is you have to meet one of these top 3 categories. So you have to either be a federally recognized American Indian tribe or Alaska Native village. You have to be a communications provider or other entity that provides communications or other services, provided you are owned and controlled by a federally recognized tribe or consortium of tribes. Or the third category is tribal colleges and universities that, again, are owned and controlled by federally recognized tribes. The FCC didn't go into whether you have to be 100% owned or just majority owned to be an eligible applicant. There is some precedent out there that suggests the FCC might be willing to consider an entity that is majority owned by a tribal entity, but not 100% owned. But to play it safe, the easiest way to satisfy this requirement is to be 100% owned. The second requirement is you have to have a local presence. So that means if you're a tribe in Maine, you can't be claiming eligible spectrum for tribal lands in Arizona. That makes sense. The FCC didn't provide much context on this issue, but it's relatively self-explanatory, and we're happy to work with you if you do have questions about whether you do have a local presence. Sure.
So we've been pushing them on some of this stuff, and I'm wondering, the answers that we're getting to the FCC in this last week, they're not set in stone, right?
Well, so this criteria is set in stone. It's part of an adopted rule at this juncture.
No, what I mean is the stuff I've heard in the last week. So for example, they say majority owned.
Right, so that is still an open question.
Well,
So-
actually, the order does say more than 50%.
It does?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
there you go. Well,
And owned and controlled.
got it. Okay, so there you go.
And the local presence thing as well. The thing that they changed with that is there's been situations where different federally recognized tribes live on other people's tribal lands. They're not going to accept that. That's what they say now, but if you can push on that.
That's a gray area.
Yeah.
That's definitely a gray area.
Can you touch on Hawaii, please?
So, if you look at the definition here of an eligible tribe, it's a federally recognized American Indian tribe and Alaska Native village. What it doesn't make eligible is an entity that is, a Hawaiian homeland area. So unfortunately for Hawaii,
In Hawaii, and Jeff also knows this context, there's not a single tribe, or there's not a single people that is recognized as a federal tribe, and so it's the nation, right, of Hawaii.
So the definition of tribal lands
Right.
originated in the subsidy rules of the FCC, as Irene indicated earlier, and were carried over from one set of rules to other set of rules throughout the FCC not only subsidizes, but of course licenses as well. And when the Office of Native Affairs and Policy was created, my office utilized the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act to assert federal jurisdiction over lands that were reserved by the federal government for the repopulation of Native Hawaiians. And I think I should recognize that there's an attorney here on behalf of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands and the Washington representative of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, two entities that could very easily be recognized by the FCC as licensable entities. In other contexts, for instance, for the preservation and protection of sacred sites, the FCC recognizes the rights of Native Hawaiian organizations under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So that is one issue that our subcommittee is willing to advise the FCC on, that it needs to recognize not only that Hawaiian homelands are licensable in the tribal priority, but also that there are entities that are licensable there too, that have responsibility for Native communities in Hawaii.
And they recognize it's included that the Hawaiian homelands are eligible to be licensed. However, like you're saying here, who can apply? There's no one who can apply for it.
Right, the geographic area of Hawaiian homelands is eligible. It's the applicant issue that requires some further pressing on the FCC. All right, so what if mutually exclusive applications are filed? We touched on this before in Mariel's presentation, but applications are considered mutually exclusive when two entities apply for the same exact spectrum frequencies in the same geographic area. There are ways, again, to resolve mutually exclusive applications before their filing, either by geographic partitioning or disaggregation of the channels. So we do encourage folks to try to work those disputes out now before filing, because once you do file, there are federal laws that may require your applications then to go to auction.
And can we just say that auction is probably unaffordable?
Well, so what's unclear is who would be able to participate in the auction.
Can you go back a couple slides? The auction is between the two people that are talking to that.
Oh, it doesn't go to
It
public.
doesn't go to public auction, it
Okay.
goes between Mr. Garcia and myself for the same lands that we both put a bid on.
But there are also corporate ways to structure, if you can't resolve the issue of who's going to apply for certain spectrum in certain geographic areas, there's also corporate solutions. So you could have an applicant that's 50% owned by the competing parties, and then you can resolve the dispute on the back end once you've secured the license, rather than forcing one of the entities to pay money to the federal government for an asset that's going to be given away for free otherwise. So there are ways to resolve these disputes on the front end rather than having this go to auction.
So, if I may, so an example would be the phone company that is next door to us that should be provided service, but that's another story. And the tribe decides to take that spectrum, but the phone company is also interested. The difference would be that the tribe would have first take on it because of the priority.
So not exactly.
No.
This would be an issue that would arise if two of these eligible applicants both tried to claim spectrum for the same geographic area. So for example, if a tribally owned casino and a tribally owned communications provider,
No, if the communications provider is not a tribal entity.
if they're not a tribal entity, they're not eligible to apply.
They're not at this point.
Right.
They're afterward, after the
That's
bids
it.
are open.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, that's what I
So-
was.
So they won't have any role in a mutually exclusive application.
Can you go back to that slide, the mutually exclusive one?
Sure. So again, this is a congressional mandate that is outside of the FCC's jurisdiction. So to the extent there are mutually exclusive applications filed, the FCC likely won't be able to do anything about it. Its hands will be tied.
And Sean, you're going to make this presentation available to folks?
This presentation is available on our website, both in a PDF form and then also a webinar form. And again, I could provide the link to folks who are interested.
And if I may, on behalf of NCAI, please sign the sign-in sheet and make sure your email address is legible. We'll provide all those materials to you by email. Thank you.
And the last issue that I'd like to address before we open it up to some of the other panelists is something that's been touched upon here, and it's, can a license holder either lease or sell the license after it's awarded? And the answer is yes and no. So a license holder can lease the spectrum the day the license is awarded. So this is really important for a couple of reasons. One, if you claim all 3 channels over your tribal land, you could, for example, lease one of those channels to another entity, to a Sprint, use some of those revenues from that lease to then pay for the construction and operation of your own facilities. You could also lease all of the facilities or all of the spectrum or some of the spectrum to another entity. And if that entity builds facilities in your license area, then you have now satisfied your build-out requirement. So you don't have to be, you as the licensee, don't need to be the one who is actually constructing the network. It could be someone else on your behalf through this lease, and then you have then met your build-out requirement.
Can you go to the
Just need to make sure that they meet those timelines though.
Exactly.
Can you go to the build-out requirements?
Sure. And I skipped over this slide because I didn't want this build-out requirement to dissuade anyone from filing in this tribal window, because these build-out requirements are easily meetable. And why don't you take it up?
I mean, well, this is the one I feel like is actually substantial, which is how can I cover 80% of my population? We'll help you, we can give you plans pretty soon that will tell you how to cover 80% of your population with broadband speeds. This is the one that's like the fail-safe. One link per 25,000 persons using 2.5. Matt just stepped out of the room, but you're looking at something that's like $1,000. You can put up a micro pop, and I don't know how many people are on your lands, but for most of our partners, one micro pop will satisfy. The build-out requirements are not an issue. One that's actually useful, and one that's to make sure that you don't lose your license.
Right. And one thing to keep in mind also is, so the penalty, if you don't meet your build-out requirement, is a license revocation. So that means the FCC takes away your license, but they don't penalize you financially for this. So if you decide that you want to apply for the license, you obtain it, you don't meet your build-out requirement, which everyone should meet their build-out requirement, but just say you don't meet your build-out requirement. The only thing that happens is they take away this license that you didn't have as of today anyway. So it's relatively low stakes to file an application to get in the game and to get this license. So again, back to leasing and selling of the license. So you can lease right away, but you cannot sell the license right away. So there's FCC lore of the days in the 1980s when the FCC was awarding these licenses by lottery to anyone who showed up and filed at the FCC, and folks were taking these licenses, turning around and selling them for millions of dollars. It made a lot of people rich. So the FCC has now put in some type of speculation and unjust enrichment protections to ensure that folks don't just file for a license and turn around and sell it right away. So what that means is if you do apply for one of these licenses, you cannot sell the license until you have met your build-out requirement. Again, we think the build-out requirement is going to be very easy to meet for almost everyone. So to the extent you are interested in selling this, then you certainly can. A couple of other points that are important to keep in mind. So if you apply for all 3 channels if all 3 channels are available to you, and you apply for all 3 channels, the build-out requirement applies to the license, not the channels. So if you construct facilities that use one of the channels, you have then met the build-out requirement for all 3 channels associated with that license. So that's an important piece. The other piece is you can certainly then sell some of the channels. So you apply for a license that has 3 channels available to it. You build out on 1 of the channels or 2 of the channels. You can sell the other channel that you're not using.
Sell lease, you mean lease?
Well, you could disaggregate the frequencies from the license and then sell those frequencies to another entity.
So in the FCC workshop on Sunday, they talked about also making those 1 megahertz guard bands available. And earlier we were speaking about entities that may have pieces of the bands, perhaps near that guard band. Is there any economic value in obtaining that 1 megahertz and building it out and possibly trying to come to an agreement with an entity that possesses the license that was right up against that guard band?
So that's a great question. The answer is maybe. And there's a couple of issues here that are still not entirely clear. So the FCC is going to be releasing a public notice, hopefully in the very near future, maybe as soon as the next week or 2. That's going to lay out a couple of really important details, including when the filing window is going to be, but then also information such as if there's only that 1 megahertz channel available to an entity, is that entity eligible to apply and take part in this travel filing window? That's unclear still. That public notice will provide some additional detail on that. But my recommendation would be, because this is a sort of once in a lifetime opportunity here, if that 1 megahertz channel is the only thing that's available to you, it probably makes sense to apply for a license, because again, if you can't sell it to another entity or you can't make use of it through some type of facility, through MuralNet or someone else, then you're just giving up something that you didn't have as of today anyway. So, and the licensing process, the filing process is going to be relatively easy for most folks, so it's not going to be costly or time prohibitive.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up from that, the FCC workshop session. With the map that the FCC is using, there are areas that will be entirely covered over tribal lands. Those licenses are already obtained. But if they make those guard bands available, so I don't know if that was a misspeak in there, but they said there would be at least 1 megahertz available over all tribal lands. And,
Last Thursday it wasn't included, and then Sunday it was included. I don't know if it's fully thought out, and I don't know whether to push or not. And I'll refer to the FCC folks in the room about how to deal with that.
There's nobody from the FCC here.
Oh, sorry, former recovering.
So, yeah, there's a lot of things, I think, but there's a lot of things to comment on, and this is, it appears as though this is going to be the one shot at 2.5 gigahertz. There's other things out there. There are other rulemakings that have long been waiting in the wings at the FCC and other things we're going to advocate on. But I think the opportunity to hear from these 3 folks who do this and deploy networks is really important. And it's rare that you have a word that transcends into a verb. So we got a guy here from Google. That would be really interesting to hear from his thoughts as well. And then Matt and I have been keeping track of a couple of things that we would, like what you just mentioned, we'd be happy to react to before we finish this subject, along with some sort of practical to-do list things as you think about getting a license and what to do next. Licensing, engineering, legal. But I would throw it to this gentleman, Kris.
You have to remind me of the specific question.
Actually, it's to provide your thoughts before we get in deep into questions as well.
Yeah, so what brings me here is the volunteer side of me, the native side of me. I'm a member of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. It's my passion that brings me here. It's not that Google was knocking on my desk saying, what can we do to help? But at the same time, there's a lot of passionate people within Google. Our executive sponsor internally has been Surf. He's most notably known for helping with the internet. So the internet is literally his baby, and he wants lots of people to enjoy that baby. And in some ways, he's not exactly happy with the way that it's been used and distributed. So there's a vested interest, good people who want to make sure that this window isn't missed. And in particular, given the history of claiming resources, we have a short window, and whether we understand it or not, we have to find a way to make decisions, even if it just buys us more time. And so that's, I think education is a big piece, and we'll talk about like next steps. But every tribe should be looking up if spectrum's available. Every tribe should be considering how they could use that spectrum and what they could use it for. And we should have these disputes everywhere that we're working out amicably. To say, well, you want it and I want it, let's figure it out. But we should, all the space should go claimed. If there's a way to make that happen, this group of people, everyone in the room that you showed up, it's because you care, have to take advantage of that. Once it goes to auction, it's never coming back. The other spectrum bands have proven the price tag is too high, and they can perpetually renew it. And once infrastructure is built, it's not likely going to change.
Dara, do you have a question?
Dara, do you have a question?
Yeah. I'm Dara Blackwater. I'm a law student at the University of Arizona, and I've heard a few people refer to spectrum as a natural resource throughout this talk. So I'm just curious on any or all of your thoughts